So I'm now pleased to present Alex Epstein. In fact, I'm pleased to meet him myself. It's been quite a chore getting you on stage here, Alex. Alex is going to make a case, a surprising case, a case that you almost never hear anymore, a moral case for what is today's favorite environmental whipping boy, fossil fuels.
So when I was researching the book, The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels, I came upon a story that I think captures a dimension of this debate that is almost never mentioned. So the story is about a newborn baby, the kind of baby that in the US and Canada would be almost unremarkable. It weighed 3.5 pounds, so it was a bit premature, but using our technology, that baby would easily be born healthy and grow up a healthy child and hopefully a healthy adult. But the baby was not in the United States or Canada. The baby was in the Gambia, a very poor country in Africa. And while in the United States or Canada, the baby would have been given an incubator to grow and be healthy, in the Gambia, they don't use incubators in their hospitals. And the reason is not just because incubators are a little bit expensive, the reason is because incubators require something that we take for granted, which is cheap, plentiful, and reliable energy, and in particular, reliable electricity. And so an observer who was at the hospital had to watch this 3.5-pound baby die because that baby did not have an incubator, because that baby did not have cheap, plentiful, reliable energy. And this illustrates a truth that I think goes almost completely unmentioned in our civilization. We always talk about being green, about the ideal of minimizing our impact on the planet. It's considered bad to have a footprint. But if you think about it, nature doesn't give us a good standard of living. The people in the Gambia have a very, very low footprint compared to ours. Human life requires transforming nature, improving it to meet human needs. Now, in the process of that, in the process of using technology, we will always create risks and side effects. But at least most of the time, the benefits far outweigh the risks. And that's what I believe is the case for the most demonized technology in our civilization, which is fossil fuel energy. So if you look at the trends, I like to start with 1980, because that's the year that I was born. And even back in 1980, my parents were being told, we need to get off our addiction to fossil fuels, and didn't. They failed according to the prevailing morality. Right now, we use 80% more fossil fuels worldwide than we did in 1980. And that's considered a bad thing. Now, it's important to ask, why do we use so many fossil fuels? Is it just an accident? And I'm going to argue that it's not, that we use it for the same reason that we use almost any other technology, because it is the cheapest, most plentiful, most reliable solution for the job. And when nuclear is a better solution, we use that, and when hydro is a better solution, we use that, leaving aside different kinds of subsidies. But most of the time, fossil fuel energy is the way that the most people can afford the most energy and get it most reliably. And so with that in mind, I want to tell you another story about a baby. Now, this baby was born in a much worse situation than the baby in the Gambia. This baby was actually the baby of two friends of mine named David and Leanne. And it was born, this boy was born almost 3 months premature. But he had an advantage that the baby in the Gambia didn't. He had something that thriving human life requires. He had machines to support his life, and he had the energy to fuel those machines. And overwhelmingly, it was fossil fuel energy. So without going into all the details, through all kinds of miracles involving hospitals and 3-month stays and helicopters even, this baby is completely healthy. So we almost never hear this mentioned when we talk about fossil fuels. Now, the story I told you does not prove that fossil fuels are good or that they should be used. What I think it does illustrate, though, is that when we discuss fossil fuels, we don't discuss it in a very careful and morally responsible way. The way I got into this industry, I'm not in the industry, but the way I got interested in this industry was not from the perspective of I wasn't born in Canada, I was born in the US, I was born in the Washington, D.C. area, no connections to the industry growing up, no connections in my professional career. I came to all of these conclusions and was broke most of the time, as many writers are. I came to this from the perspective of philosophy. My background is in moral philosophy, and moral philosophy is all about how to think carefully about issues. And I think there are at least three things you need to be clear about when you talk about the morality of anything. One is, what is our goal? What do we consider moral? Two, what are the benefits of the thing? And three, what are the risks of the thing? So we absolutely need to talk about any climate-related risks, any pollution-related risks, any depletion-related risks, but we also need to be very careful about how big those risks are and how they contrast to the benefits. Because if we don't think about it carefully, then we won't make the right decision. So for me, the way I try to think of everything is, my goal is to maximize human well-being. I don't believe in minimizing human impact. I believe in minimizing any negative impacts to humans. But I believe we should make a good footprint on the Earth, a big one, as big as we need to maximize our well-being. And we need to look at the benefits and the risks. So I think a good way to understand the benefits and the risks, or the benefits and the concerns about fossil fuels, is to understand what fossil fuels are. I often poll people and say, do you think you could give me a good definition of what fossil fuels are, or a good explanation of how they work? And you can think inside your head right now whether you think you can give one. And most of the time, people can't. And philosophically, this is a big problem. Because how are we going to have an intelligent discussion about something and we don't know what it is? And usually, most of us feel very comfortable expressing strong opinions about fossil fuels, and we call each other names, but we don't really know what we're talking about. So briefly, what are fossil fuels? I think this is a helpful definition. They're high-energy hydrocarbons, many of which originated from ancient dead plants. So high-energy hydrocarbons, many of which originated from ancient dead plants. And all of these elements are important. So if you take the graphic on the right, it shows the basic process by which at least many of what we call fossil fuels, or most of what we call fossil fuels, originated. And basically, it takes the energy from plants, which is energy from the sun, and through various geological processes, that energy gets super, super compressed into coal, oil, and natural gas. Now, coal, oil, and natural gas, as you can see in the diagram on the left, they're made up primarily of hydrogen and carbon atoms that have very, very strong chemical bonds. So if you get this, you get pretty much everything both positive and potentially negative about fossil fuels. Because what happens is we take these hydrocarbons and we burn them. So when we burn something, we introduce oxygen to it. We add oxygen. And so what happens is the hydrogen becomes, what happens when you add hydrogen to oxygen? What does it become? Water. And the carbon, what happens when you add carbon to oxygen? Carbon dioxide, CO2. So that's the whole global warming concern. So one becomes carbon dioxide, the other is water, and then the energy that was holding them together is released and it generates energy. So these are the sort of two primary things that we talk about today. So we get energy from it, but we also get CO2 from it. Now the other thing that we get from it that's a little more subtle, that's connected to the fact that it's plants, is we can get different kinds of things like smog. And the way that works is that plants naturally aren't just made of carbon and hydrogen and oxygen. They also have things like nitrogen and sulfur in them. And when you combine nitrogen with oxygen, you get different nitrogen oxides, which can contribute to air quality problems. And when you combine sulfur with oxygen, you get what's called sulfur dioxide. I'm from the Los Angeles area, and that used to have really big smog problems. So that's how it works. So it's all about these hydrocarbons from ancient dead plants. Now, I talked about the benefits. One of the responses to that is to say, well, there are no real benefits. There's nothing uniquely beneficial about fossil fuels. We can just replace them with free, clean, renewable energy. So this is a little cartoon that says, look, if we just get rid of fossil fuels, even if there's no climate catastrophe, we'll be better off. And I think this is a really false and irresponsible view. And I think a person who summarized the core reason why that you might not expect was Jimmy Fallon. Is everyone familiar with the host of The Tonight Show? So this, before I show you Jimmy Fallon, this is just one graphic that I think shows the fallacy of saying, oh, there are no downsides of getting off fossil fuels and switching to wind and solar. This is one of the most dangerous and deadly kinds of mining operations in the world. It's called a rare earth mine. So this doesn't exist with producing oil or coal or gas. It does exist with producing wind turbines. And in my book, I have a story told from someone who went there about people getting large amounts of cancer, about people softening bones, because they're dealing with very dangerous radioactive materials, and the Chinese don't have very good laws about these things. So that's an indication that we have a debate that's not evenly focused on the risks and benefits of all technologies. They tend to only focus on the risks of fossil fuels and not the benefits. And then with solar and wind, they tend to focus only on the benefits and not the risks. And whatever the conclusion ends up being, philosophically, morally, that's not a responsible way to debate. So here's what Jimmy has to say.
New Scientist magazine reported on Wednesday that in the future, cars could be powered by hazelnuts. That's encouraging, considering an 8-ounce jar of hazelnuts costs about $9. Yeah, I got an idea for a car that runs on bald eagle heads and Fabergé eggs.
Okay, that's funny, right? But think about it. Hazelnut energy is renewable energy. It's plant-based energy. It comes from the sun, just like the energy from solar panels. And since the sun is the primary thing that causes the wind through heating, it's the basis of wind energy. So why is it so expensive? And the reason is because energy is not just something we get from the sun. It has to be processed. All forms of energy are forms of a technological process. And to understand the energy and to understand the benefits and the risks, you need to understand the costs of the whole process. Because if the process of turning the sunlight into energy is too expensive or too unreliable, it doesn't matter that the sun is free if all the other elements are super expensive. And to give you a sense of how inefficient these technologies are compared to fossil fuels and nuclear and hydro, and by the way, nuclear and hydro are opposed by many of the same people who oppose fossil fuels. Let's look at Germany. So Germany is considered the ultimate success story in solar and wind. They have what they would call invested, I would call subsidized, more solar and wind combined than anyone else. And if you look at this graph, and this is taking the most up-to-date data we could get from the German government, notice that most of the vast majority of the time, it's not even a significant percentage of the electricity, and this doesn't even include the fuel for the cars or the heating for the homes. But also notice the low points. Notice that in the winter, when Germany needs the most electricity, there's the least available. And sometimes there's less than 3% of what they expect, or the maximum potential available. And what does that mean? That means the whole time, 100% of the time, they have to be prepared for it to produce virtually no energy. So here's a fact. Germany is now at a record in terms of coal capacity. In terms of the ability to produce coal power, it's at a record. Because they're not renewables, they're unreliables. That's a much more accurate term for them. So this whole experiment that makes Germans pay 4 times as much for electricity as Americans, think about what that does, particularly to the electricity bill of a poor person, or what it does to industry. All of these solar panels and windmills, if they went down tomorrow, there would be no problem, and it would be actually easier to operate the grid. Now, if the world's fossil fuels went down, that would be a global catastrophe. If we look at the past several decades, we see that even with all the problems in China and India, you have, as fossil fuel use goes up dramatically, so too does life expectancy. Now, as we wrap up, I want to take a look at the issue of climate, but I want to look at it from a different perspective than is normally taken. So what we hear about climate is things like, we're going to burn up. And in 1985, John Holdren, who is President Obama's science advisor, predicted that by the year 2020, we would have 1 billion climate-related famine deaths. 1 billion. So what actually happened? And what I want to look at is not exactly what the temperature has been, although you've seen some interesting graphs about that are important. I want to look at what's the trend in how many people are living and dying from climate. Because what we're told is every time someone dies in a storm, this is an indication that our climate is more dangerous than ever. But they never show us the big picture. They never show us overall, how much more dangerous is the climate getting, and is that a big enough problem to talk about reducing fossil fuels? So when I saw the truth of this, I was shocked. Because it's not just that climate-related deaths aren't getting that much worse. It's that as we use more fossil fuels, they get dramatically better. Climate-related deaths, since significant CO2 emissions began, are down 98%. 98%. Now, this is almost impossible in the way we're taught to think of things. How could this be? Did we make the climate that much better through CO2? No. We might have made it a little better. I don't think we can really know how much. Here's what we do know, though. There are three basic impacts to the world of climate and plants when we burn fossil fuels. One is there's a mild warming effect from CO2. There's a more significant plant growth effect, but the third thing is the one we completely ignore. There's an enormous climate protection effect from energy. So nature doesn't give us a safe climate that we make dangerous. It gives us an incredibly dangerous climate that we make safe. And that's why the more fossil fuels we put in people's hands, the more cheap, plentiful, reliable energy we have, the more we protect them from climate. So when the Pope or the G7 talk about, I care about the poor people, therefore we should reduce CO2 emissions, they've got it exactly backward. If you actually want to protect those people from storms and floods and everything else, we've got the evidence and the logic that they absolutely need more of the best forms of energy, including fossil fuel energy. So going forward, I believe our policy should be one of energy liberation, where we're free to use as many fossil fuels as we want, as long as we have proper pollution controls in place, and where we're free to innovate with other technologies like nuclear and hydro, and solar and wind, if they ever become economic. So you've seen some of the historical context. This is a pretty dramatic illustration of the fertilizer effect. Now, this is what happens when you put more CO2, what happens with plant growth. But the main overall lesson is not that my conclusion about fossil fuels is correct. I hope you check out the book or check out the first chapter online for free at moralcaseforfossilfuels.com. It's the methodology that I use that I don't think is used in our culture. And so that methodology is saying, look, our goal should be to maximize human well-being, to improve as many lives as possible, and to do that responsibly, just as we look at all the benefits and risks of vaccines and look at the big picture, so we need to do that for fossil fuels. So I hope you find that framework helpful, and thank you for having me.